Every time Netflix drops a new show about another infamous serial killer, people worry that the creator will try to humanize the serial killer in some way, which everyone seems to agree is a bad thing. But what if I told you that you're all wrong?
I just get angry with other people who think that they have a right to somehow try to blame my parents for what happened.
I've met a lot of men who were motivated to commit violence just like me.
I don't care about myself, really. I don't care about what happens to me. I never did, really.
A couple of months ago, I decided to watch the latest installment of Ryan Murphy's series Monster, which loosely told the story of Ed Gein, the infamous grave robber who inspired far sicker abominations than he ever was in movies like Psycho, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Silence of the Lambs. The first reason I didn't plan on watching it was because I'd given up watching the one on the Menendez brothers for reasons we'll discuss later, and I initially turned off the Jeffrey Dahmer one mere minutes in when I determined that Evan Peters was obviously born to play a sick nigga, and I like to sleep at night. And another reason I really wasn't itching to watch it was because, despite every other household in the country binging the series the moment it came out, every YouTube video about the show that I came across was slamming it as the worst thing they'd ever seen for one reason or another. Most of the criticism I saw revolved around people accusing Ryan Murphy of sexualizing and humanizing these notorious monsters, as well as just not staying true to the actual facts of what happened. Some criticism specifically took issue with Ryan Murphy casting very attractive people like Charlie Hunman, Evan Peters, Nicholas Alexander Chavez, and Cooper Koch to portray these horrific people. Critics argued that by virtue of their good looks, people would humanize and lust after them, and that they should thus be casting very ugly people to play these roles because people would be more likely to appropriately hate them for their crimes. But my best friend Mark demanded that I watch the Ed Gein installment. He insisted that it was phenomenal and that I give it a chance and form my own opinion despite what I'd heard on YouTube. I'm keeping it cute, but what Mark actually said when I informed him that his new favorite show was getting dragged all up and down the YouTube streets was, "Oh, them, those hating ass YouTubers, they don't know shit."
What did he say fuck me for?
So upon Mark's insistence, I put other people's critiques out of my mind and I watched the show, which then led me to finally biting the bullet and watching the one on Dahmer, before ultimately going all the way down a full-blown rabbit hole that ended in me watching copious amounts of serial killer interviews, shows, documentaries, and reading the memoirs of several people close to infamous serial killers. Serial killers are fascinating because they are the one kind of criminal that everyone agrees needs to be thrown under the jail. And that's a minimum. Many people would probably also insist we throw them into jail. Serial killers are always presented to us as these super intelligent, cunning, manipulative, evil monsters who are just evil to their core, and there's nothing that could have been done to prevent them from being that way, and there's nothing that could have been done to stop their killing sprees. Serial killers are fascinating because in so many ways, they are a work of propaganda. What is propaganda? Propaganda refers to media and entertainment designed to manufacture support for police, prisons, and the prison industrial complex. The term serial killer and the criminal profiling associated with them was literally created by the FBI, which is why everything about how we're taught about them by both the police and the media is designed to make us throw up our hands and point to the jails and the electric chair for these monsters, because the American government's position on crime is never to get to the root causes to actually try to prevent crime. Of course not. Prisons and policing are a business that rely on the cycle continuing and expanding. The American government's position is to just keep throwing more money at policing and prisons.
People have this high level of fascination in serial killers. While obviously their behaviors are extreme and disquieting and all the rest, it suggests that there's somehow like this radically different thing that's over there. But in fact, they are an expression of, some fundamental truths about American society. And this is a very much an American phenomenon, right? This is not a universal phenomenon. It's not like every millionth person genetically is going to move in this direction. That America is producing these folks. Part of our interest and fascination with them is that it makes us, on the one hand, feel better about us. Whatever bad things I've done or seen, at least I'm not that. So it allows us to feel like we're on the good side and there's someone out there that is clearly on the bad side. And we can take this a little step further and say that it plays into this idea that there is evil in the world and that we want to understand it. And it has an almost religious-like quality to it, right? This reassurance, right, of good and evil. Ultimately, this is a kind of false binary that's being produced.
Which is what makes serial killers the perfect agent of propaganda and legitimizing the functions of prisons and excusing the failures of police. Think about it. Serial killers are extreme, rare cases of crime that barely account for crime in the US. But due to the horrific and evil nature of serial killers' crimes that shock the conscience and the nation in a way that everyone not only agrees that these are monsters that we can't do anything about, we dehumanize them. And it's that dehumanization that makes us not bat an eye when we learn Jeffrey Dahmer was brutally murdered in prison by another incarcerated person, because we think they're monsters who deserve what they get. The problem is, serial killers are few and far between, but the same dehumanization and disregard we feel when Dahmer is killed in prison is what we extend to the people killed in US jails and prisons all across the country each and every day, many of whom are there for nonviolent crimes of poverty, many of whom have been convicted and are awaiting trial because they can't afford bail. It's rare we hear about the daily murders that happen behind bars, because collectively as a society, we don't see the people in jails and prisons as we see each other. And that makes way for any and everything to be done to them. That's why serial killers are beloved by police, media, and other propagandists.
It serves a kind of ideological political purpose of saying that the world's problems can kind of be reduced to these questions of good and evil. And of course, who defines what evil is in this context? It gets extended to all kinds of questions. The behavior of young people who harm someone, the behavior of anyone who we find to be out of step, disquieting, a source of fear for us, whether it's an unhoused person with a mental health problem or a recently arrived migrant engaged in like panhandling or soliciting day labor or whatever. This is like those people are outside the pale, and there are good people and bad people, and those people are on the other side. The world is a lot more complicated than that. There's a lot more gray areas than that. There's not the simplistic line between good and bad, offender, victim, guilty, innocent, lawful, unlawful.
That dehumanization that we are tricked into believing is necessary in order to rightly condemn harm and hold people accountable for their harm not only becomes the basis for excusing police failures and the atrocities of an unjust criminal system, it becomes the reason we don't even attempt to get to the root of how and why people become criminals or commit harm, or what could be done differently to prevent it. And we're not crazy to feel this way. We're not the only ones who worry that humanizing a killer, trying to understand how and why they did what they did, or sympathizing with their backstory can veer into blaming other people or things for their actions. Even Jeffrey Dahmer himself worried about this.
Your dad has wondered about all kinds of things, from the medication that your mom was on during her pregnancy, to the fact that you were exposed to violent arguments in the home from an early age and continuing, to the possibility that he might have passed on some genetic propensity for obsession or violent behavior. Does any of that ring true to you?
I could see why he'd wonder about those things, but as far as I'm concerned, they're all excuses. Because I didn't feel accountable to anybody. I didn't feel that I had to face what I had done ever. And so there comes a point where a person has to be accountable for what he's done. Can't go around making excuses, blaming other people or other things. So I alone am the one who's responsible for what's happened.
And the dehumanization of criminals isn't something we're tricked into feeling passively. We also demand it. And that's at the heart of the unanimous impulse everyone feels to lash out at anyone depicting serial killers or other criminals as full people who lived lives where they experienced trauma, where they themselves were once victims. Because we confuse explanation with excuse. We confuse humanity with sympathy. So we look at any attempt to remind us that the people who commit these horrible crimes were people. We look at any attempt to visit the lives of these people to understand how they came to be as an attempt to make us sympathize with them, which we see as an affront to their victims. Because we think honoring victims means presenting their killers as one-dimensional monsters or pure evil who were born, not made. But humanizing people who commit crimes is not about sympathy. It's about humanity. Humanity creates a line we can't and don't cross that's not based on how we feel about the person or what they've done. It's about how we feel about their humanity and what's humane to do to other people, period. It's humanity at the heart of why someone might oppose the death penalty in all circumstances, no matter what a person's done to deserve it. It's not about sympathy. It's humanity that makes you consider how being neglected by his parents, abandoned by his mother, and left alone to quietly become an alcoholic and hate himself for being gay contributed to who Jeffrey Dahmer became.
Did you ever consider talking to your parents, to your dad, about homosexuality? Is that something you felt you could ever raise?
Early on, I really didn't know that much about it myself. All I knew was that it was something that was to be kept hush-hush, not talked about, not even thought about. So I just kept it all within me and never talked about sexual issues at all, really, with anybody.
You do not have to feel sympathy for Jeffrey Dahmer to recognize his humanity so that you can understand how it eroded over time. But if you did feel sympathy for the Dahmers of the world, for the children they were, or who they were before they became what they did, does that mean you can't or don't feel the wealth of sympathy for their victims? Does that mean you can't or don't recognize them as evil, sick who did evil, sick things? Can we not hold space for multiple things? Moreover, mustn't we? Even Dahmer's own father, who loved him, supported him, and thought it was important to humanize him, never did any of these things because he was trying to free his son or shield his son from accountability. In fact, years before Tracy Edwards escaped and led police to Jeffrey Dahmer, which ended in his arrest and the uncovering of his horrors, when Jeffrey Dahmer was arrested and convicted for child molestation, his father Lionel wrote to Jeffrey's attorney and then the judge, begging to keep Jeffrey in prison unless or until he could get treatment for his alcoholism, which is something we'll talk about a lot more in depth later. And when Jeffrey was finally arrested for murder and his father finally learned what he was, he stood by his son because he was his son, and because supporting his son was never about trying to defend his son's actions, pretending his son was okay, or getting his son off for his crimes. As Lionel Dahmer said, it was never a question of guilt, a question of Jeff's being released, but only of whether he'd be placed in a prison or in a mental institution. So what is the cost of recognizing his son's humanity and exploring how it was lost? I do not feel sorry for Jeffrey Dahmer. And I am not trying to make you feel sorry for Jeffrey Dahmer. In fact, I am trying to explain that humanizing someone is not the same as feeling sorry for them, victimizing them, mitigating their actions, or holding someone other than them responsible for their crimes. It's important that we humanize people like Jeffrey Dahmer because it's necessary that we never lose sight of the fact that you can want to convince yourself that these people are monsters, abominations, and some kind of aberration of mankind because it's too difficult to digest what people are capable all you want. But the facts are that human beings are capable of believing, doing, and becoming horrible things. And the world we live in, the world around them, does bear some responsibility in who we all become.
For many serial killers, we know, for instance, that they were exposed to horrific levels of abuse, and that this has directly contributed to a kind of warped sensibility that confuses intimacy with humiliation, for instance. That is very common with people who've suffered childhood extreme psychological and sexual physical abuse, that the people who love them are also the people who humiliate and torture them. And so this changes their mind structures around these ideas so that they receive, for instance, sexual pleasure from humiliating people. And that's not because they're some evil monster, it's because they were produced by a system that allows these things to happen to kids, fails to provide them with support, fails to believe them when they say these things are happening to them. And these are very American phenomena, unfortunately.
It's important to remember Jeffrey Dahmer was a human being, if for no other reason than to be a cautionary tale. There's a utility in revisiting Jeffrey Dahmer's childhood and deciding that if there's even a possibility that neglecting your children or fighting with your spouse could have these kinds of catastrophic consequences, that you would be better off being emotionally involved in your children's lives and getting to know them. There is utility in understanding what underlying beliefs, themes, and ideas influence them and exploring how it could have been avoided. That being said, There is a difference between humanizing these people and sensationalizing them, sexualizing them, romanticizing them, or glorifying them. That's why it's important to understand that deification is another form of dehumanization. And as such, there are legitimate criticisms made of some of these TV and movie adaptations of the life and crimes of serial killers. And we're going to discuss them later as we talk about Monster's installment of Ed Gein and the Menendez brothers. But first, I want to stick on humanity, Jeffrey Dahmer and his installment of Monster, which starred Evan Peters. But before we dive headfirst into Dahmer, let me tell you about the sponsor of this video, Straight Arrow News, because I love them down and they are the only reason I was able to make this long ass video. Straight Arrow News made sure that I could weed through all the propaganda, the misinformation, the outright lies, and even AI to determine what's real and what's fake news. And Straight Arrow News' media mist doesn't just make sure I know whether the information I'm relying on is coming from the left, the right, or the center. They also make sure I'm informed about things the mainstream media isn't even bothering to report on in the first place. Their media mist intentionally spotlights important stories that both the left and the right are underreporting so that I don't miss a thing. That could not be more important to me in 2025. For example, look at how the left is covering updates on Luigi Mangioni's trial versus how the right is. We need Straight Arrow News so we don't miss how mainstream media be trying to manipulate us. So go to san.com/Illuminati to check it out or download their app for free. Yes, you heard me. Free 99. You can visit through the link in my description. When you visit, you not only support me, but you take advantage of a better way to get the news. So welcome back to Trustworthy Journalism. Thank you so much for sponsoring this video, Straight Arrow News. I am very grateful for the opportunity to explore the relationships intertwining my background with Jeff's, to shed some light on how he developed, and to show that he was not, as some people insist, born a monster. That is an excerpt from the memoir A Father's Story by Lionel Dahmer, the father of Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey Dahmer's father, Lionel, wrote that memoir because he felt obligated to interrogate how his son became the kind of person who would go on to drug, rape, murder, defile, and even eat young boys and men. We were no longer parents, and we never would be again. We were the parents, and I in particular was the father of Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey, not Jeff. Jeffrey Dahmer was someone else, the formal public name for a man who was, at least to me, still Jeff, my son. Even my son's name had become public property, foreign to me, a press report's designation, the name of a stranger, an abrupt depersonalization of someone who, at least to me, was still incontestably a person. It's easy for the rest of us to believe that some people, the Jeffrey Dahmers of the world, are just monsters. Special kinds of evil who were born that way, who were born different than you and I, capable of evils we aren't. But Lionel Dahmer knew with certainty that his son wasn't born that way. He became that way. He didn't know how he became that way, only that he had. So he retraced the steps of his and his son's life to figure out what went wrong. By the fall of 1991, Sherry and I had heard my son described so often as a monster, a ghoul, a demon, that we felt it time to speak out, to let the world know that there had been another Jeff, a little boy who had been like other little boys. In a sense, we wanted to resurrect the boyhood, though in no way to condone what the man had done. In a sense, we also wanted to speak to the victims' families, to make it known that in supporting Jeff, we were in no way supporting what he had done, but were as horrified as they were by his crimes. Lionel didn't humanize his son to excuse him, nor to justify his actions, nor to mitigate his culpability. Even Jeffrey Dahmer himself wouldn't stand for that.
To this day, I don't know what started it. And the person to blame is sitting right across from you. That's the only person. Not parents, not society, not pornography. I mean, those are just excuses. I feel it's wrong for people who commit crimes to try to shift the blame onto somebody else, onto their parents or onto their upbringing or living circumstances. I think that's just a cop-out. And my parents, my relatives, had no knowledge of what I was doing. They're absolutely not responsible for any of it in any way. I take full responsibility.
And Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker who brutally murdered at least 13 people, took a similar position to Jeffrey Dahmer. But he went a step further, arguing that he was born evil.
I believe in the evil in human nature. This is a wicked world. And in a wicked world, wicked people are born. I'm not gonna blame society, my race, or people, or anything. It is up to the individual like myself to keep on knocking on whatever door they want to get into.
Lionel Dahmer was a scientist who described himself as analytical. He was someone who wanted to understand how things worked, and so he studied them. He did the same thing with his son Jeff after he became known to the world as Jeffrey Dahmer, but not immediately. Lionel Dahmer said, "During the whole course of the trial, while I sat in my place, staring straight ahead, I felt that the acts being described were those of someone I could not possibly know, much less someone I had brought into the world. I felt no connection at all to the unspeakable things that were described while cameras whirred and reporters, scores of them, scribbled notes, bringing these same horrible things to the world at large. For me, the acts that the defense and prosecution teams described during the trial remained at a horror movie distance. My son had lived in a hideous world, but I could not see it as a world that bore any relationship to mine. Instead, it was as if I were being forced to watch a horror film I did not want to watch, from which I could learn nothing, and from which I only wanted to escape. Because of that remove, I left Jeff's trial at its conclusion with no more insight into my son or myself than I'd had when it begun. I had attended the trial like an innocent bystander, my mind fixed on the technical aspects of the defense's case, its effort to prove Jeff's insanity. And so, throughout the entire 2 weeks of the court's proceedings, I was able to pigeonhole each individual horror in a neat category of physical or psychological evidence. In that way, I made sure that each item was connected exclusively to Jeff, part of his technical defense, a mere trial exhibit, not a human fact at all, and certainly not part of a larger story that was also mine. And so, it was only much later that I began to rethink not only my relationship with Jeff, but with the impulses that had overwhelmed him, and with the acts that he had carried out. Only then did I begin to realize that there were some areas of my son's mind, such as a feeling of a lack of control over many things in my life, which I had held within myself for years. Certainly, Jeff had multiplied his sexual perversions exponentially well beyond my understanding and of course far beyond my capacity to even entertain. Nonetheless, I could see their distant origins in myself, and slowly over time, I began to see him truly as my son in far deeper ways than I had previously imagined. Jeffrey Dahmer was Lionel Dahmer's own son, his first child and namesake, and even he struggled not to write him off as something foreign that he couldn't fathom how he'd come to be. Lionel said, "I still could not face the deeper and most frightening elements of my relationship to my son. I was still baffled by his acts, but I had no desire to dwell upon them. Certainly, I felt no obligation to do so. As to Jeff himself, I still could not envision him in his murderousness, but neither did I make any effort whatsoever to do that. In fact, my mind almost never returned to that part of his life. Instead, when I thought of him at all, it was as a lively little boy, frozen in his innocence, safely positioned in the distant past. But even when I thought of him as a man, a prisoner, a murderer, it seemed to me that my son was very far away from me. He was far away in the distance that physically separated us, which was obvious, but he was also far away in his character and personality, which it seemed to me was no less obvious. In both of these senses, he was where I wanted him, safely away, far, far away. For the darker side of my parenting was still beyond my grasp. Even for Jeffrey Dahmer's own father, it was easiest to create distance between him and his son. More specifically, how he himself or his parenting or his choices may have played a role in who his son became. I think we as a society have a lot in common with Lionel Dahmer. We share his fears. We fear the Jeffrey Dahmers, but even more, we fear humanizing people like Jeffrey Dahmer and what humanizing them would mean about our world around them. That's the core of what Lionel Dahmer was getting at when he said, "My son lived in a hideous world, but I could not see it as a world that bore any relationship to mine. Instead, it was as if I were being forced to watch a horror film I did not want to watch, from which I could learn nothing, and from which I only wanted to escape." It was easiest for Lionel to avoid confronting his son's life and interrogating what went wrong. And not only was it easiest, he didn't always think he had an obligation to do it. But eventually, that changed.
But parents just naturally, I mean, any parent that really cares, they just first of all say, I feel guilty. There's just feelings of guilt. What happened? What did I do? What could I have done? And so that's a normal parental reaction.
My argument is that like Lionel Dahmer came to realize, we too have an obligation to go back and try to figure out what went wrong. That's how we avoid it happening again. We write horrible people off as monsters because it's not only hard to believe that routine tragedies like neglectful parents, child abuse, loneliness, being socially outcasted, homophobia, poverty, patriarchy, and even religion can turn some people into monsters. It's easier to believe that people are born evil than to reckon with a world that allowed evil to grab hold of them. While reflecting on his son's birth, Lionel Dahmer said, "It's impossible to imagine how the end of my son's life could have sprung from the beginning of it. But impossible as it seems, it's nevertheless what happened, and we have to be willing to contend with that." I think there's something more terrifying about the circumstances of someone like Jeffrey Dahmer's life, because the circumstances weren't great, but they weren't extraordinarily bad. Meaning that he suffered, but the way he suffered was and is not unheard of or uncommon. And that's what I think is at the heart of why we prefer to believe that Jeffrey Dahmers are born and not made. Because it's easier to contend with a world where monsters are just occasionally, inexplicably born. And if they are made, that they're made as the result of some especially horrible tragedy, the kind of tragedy they whip up for fictional serial killers like Dexter, where his evil, his need to kill, is explained away as the result of witnessing his mother be murdered and dismembered, then being left in a pool of her blood in a shipping container for days when he was a child. We can accept horrible people being the result of extraordinarily horrible circumstances, because that's what we're trained to accept and expect. But we're not taught that horrible people and catastrophic evil can spring from the kind of routine, neglect, abuse, and values that our society normalizes. Which is the reason why when Jeffrey Dahmer was arrested, people speculated about whether he was beaten or sexually abused as a child, because we want to believe that that's what it takes to make a monster. It's not enough that he was neglected by his parents, abandoned by his mother, cripplingly lonely, and silently hating himself for being gay because his religion said it was a perversion. We need something more, because the idea that something as common as loneliness could manifest itself into a Dahmer is terrifying. We are terrified because if loneliness or simply being a loser can make killers and monsters out of men, that means there's way more potential danger in the world. It makes the male loneliness epidemic a threat to our safety.
I don't fit in society and I am incompetent. I'm definitely incompetent.
That's not what I would say.
Well, I say that. I say that. No, there's nothing wrong with being incompetent because you don't have to do as much. If you're competent, then you got a lot to do, see? But there's another aspect of it too. I've learned to reflect. I just reflect back. I know I don't know. I know I'm stupid. I admit I'm a petty whatever. I've never been a success at anything. I even got to the point where I didn't want to be a success at anything. What would being a success, what does that mean, you know? Money? Oh, I've had all the money in the world 3 times and I had to give it back. That's a stupid little game, you know? My awareness and my consciousness is not the same as somebody that goes to school and has a mom and dad. Not having parents have left me in another dimension, so to say, you know?
It would also mean that there's something we could do about it, meaning there's more for us to do, more for us to change and correct, more work to do than many of us are prepared to do, which is why we prefer to believe there's just some evil born into the world and that it's out of our hands, and all there is to do is to find these monsters and throw them in the jail after they've already carried out their inevitable evils.
One of your dad's biggest questions is when you began to slip away, when you crossed over into this world of obsession or dark fantasy from which you just couldn't return. Can you pinpoint that? Is there a sense for when that really began to happen with you, Jeff?
I think it was around age 14 or 15. Started having obsessive thoughts of violence intermingled with sex. And it just got worse and worse. I didn't know how to tell anyone about it, so I didn't. I just kept it all inside.
We do not want to even entertain the possibility that there is something that could be done to prevent people from becoming Jeffrey Dahmers, or that there's anything to be learned, gained, or changed on our parts by revisiting their crimes and engaging them and their life stories as anything other than monsters who killed. But I think that that's precisely what we need to do. And the lives and TV depictions of Jeffrey Dahmer, Ed Gein, Ted Bundy, and maybe even Charles Manson are the perfect vehicles for us to explore why we should actually humanize these monsters to avoid making more of them. And with their stories exposed to us about the criminal system's failures, parental abuse and neglect, the male loneliness epidemic, Son of Sam laws, victims' rights, and a billion-dollar TV media industry that exploits them more than it humanizes them. Of all the serial killers and to be fascinated by, I think Jeffrey Dahmer is the one we should all be analyzing, because he's the worst of what so many lonely boys and men could become in a world where we're constantly being warned of the male loneliness epidemic, which has resulted in many boys and men retreating into the manosphere, red pill ideology, and incel communities that prey on their misery and fuel their hatred towards the subjects of their unrequited love. Jeffrey Dahmer's pain, trauma, and every sick, depraved crime he committed all tied back to his crippling loneliness. Jeffrey Dahmer was so lonely, so desperate for human contact and connection, and so convinced that he had no way of maintaining those things, that he wanted to keep people permanently, to make them literally a part of himself so they could never leave, which is why he ate some of his victims' hearts, tried his best to preserve their skulls and body parts, and at one point was trying to turn his victims into zombies rather than kill them so that he could have a companion who could not leave, resist, or reject him. Dahmer's first victim, a young man named Stephen Hicks, he killed specifically because he tried to leave the house Dahmer had been living in all alone since his father moved out in the divorce and his mother had taken his younger brother and literally abandoned him there.
The reason why Jeffrey Dahmer was able to get away with his crimes was because of just what you are seeing here. Jeffrey Dahmer is intelligent and articulate. That is what makes him so frightening.
Let me make something abundantly clear. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was a sick, lonely, absolutely unremarkable ass. Jeffrey had no friends, no relationships, no talents, no ambition, nothing. He failed school all his life. He was not good at anything. He wasn't smart, not street smart, not book smart, no otherwise. He wasn't talented, nothing. And I do not say that to flame him. I say that because the police and the media have a vested interest in representing serial killers as these extremely intelligent, evil masterminds because they need the public to believe that in order to justify why they failed to catch someone who was on a fucking murder spree. But it's rarely the case, and it especially wasn't the case for Jeffrey Dahmer. In response to how the media rewrote who Jeffrey was, his own father said this about him: "My mind recalls only a young man who was passive and more or less nondescript. A failure at almost everything he ever tried. A mixer in a chocolate factory, a job that placed him barely above menial labor. Now, he was not only famous, but the catalyst for 1,000 different reactions. All his life, he'd seemed so very small, it seemed to me. There were times he'd been so small that I had scarcely seen him at all. Now he was gigantic, the public personality around whom enormous forces swirled. How could this be the same Jeff who spoke in mumbled sentences, who'd sold blood for liquor, who had muttered his sarcastic sorry at every offense, then slunk away embarrassed and ashamed? How could so small and insignificant a man be blown up to such dimensions at such a blinding speed? How could so gray and unaccented and generally pathetic a figure generate such passion? Never had the vast gulf separating what Jeff was and what he'd done seemed so wide. Jeffrey Dahmer was an antisocial, full-blown alcoholic by his senior year of high school. He barely graduated high school. His dad used his connections to get him into Ohio State and he flunked out his first semester. He was kicked out of the military for drinking. He was arrested for public indecency and he was arrested and convicted for raping a 13-year-old boy. The police were called several times on Jeffrey Dahmer, including when a bathhouse manager called the police because Jeffrey Dahmer had been drugging and sexually assaulting men at the bathhouses. But the police declined to investigate because of their homophobic belief that men couldn't be raped. When Jeffrey Dahmer went to murder the 14-year-old brother of the 13-year-old boy he'd been convicted of raping, the boy managed to escape and ran into two women who tried to help him by calling the police. But when Dahmer returned to the building on his walk back to the store, the police returned the distressed, delirious, half-naked, terrified child back to Dahmer, an adult man who claimed he was the child's boyfriend. I say all this to say, Jeffrey Dahmer's ability to get away with murdering 11 boys and men for 13 years didn't have shit to do with his intelligence or any skill set or ability to fool people. It had everything to do with police and systemic failure. And the news media of then and now prefer not to shed light on those facts.
This man with a quiet, almost shy demeanor became a master manipulator who was able to lure strangers he met at gay bars to his apartment. He was even able to con the police into returning a 14 13-year-old boy to him after neighbors called 911 upset that the child was in the street naked and bleeding. Dahmer convinced the police that he and the boy were simply having a lover's quarrel.
An intoxicated boyfriend of another boyfriend.
How old was the child?
It wasn't a child, it was an adult.
After the police left, Jeffrey Dahmer murdered that boy. Conorak Synthesum phone.
They go out of their way to present the extreme negligence of the police that was motivated by outright homophobia and disinterest in doing their jobs as the result of extreme cunningness on the part of Jeffrey Dahmer.
As time went on, his mind became more and more warped, and yet he was clever enough to continue to elude police and lure young men to his apartment.
The media traffics in propaganda, so despite the news from the time serving as real historical records, they don't actually present us with the reality, which is why things like Ryan Murphy's Dahmer do have value. Despite being a show based on the events and taking creative liberties here and there, unlike the news and non-fictional media about the events, the show does present the police failures to catch Dahmer and the role racism and homophobia played in why Dahmer got away with his crimes for so long as the facts that they were.
Sure. Listen to me. And because I called you, and I told you over and over a million times that something was going on, and you know what you did? Y'all did nothing. So what did y'all find in there? Huh? What did you find in there?
This is unlike the news that pose the facts as questions or opinions that could be quickly tossed aside without truly engaging it.
When it was revealed that most of the victims were black or homosexual, people in Milwaukee were incensed. Many felt that was why he went after them and why the police didn't seem to care when their families reported them missing. 10 of your 17 victims were black. Were they racially motivated?
It was not racially motivated. It was not sexual preference. It was just to find an obsession with the best-looking young man I could find.
If you notice, the media all approached the issue of racism in the case as a question of whether Jeffrey Dahmer was racist, or whether race was a factor in how he chose his victims.
Did their race matter to you?
No, their race didn't matter to me. The first two young men were white. The third young man was American Indian. The fourth and fifth were Hispanic. So no, race had nothing to do with it. It was just their looks.
The media was intentional never to engage the issue of racism with respect to the police and their failure to catch Dahmer. They always focused the attention solely on Dahmer. But Ryan Murphy's Monster presented the issue the way the media refused to, which was that racism was why the police had not taken the missing person seriously. Racism was why Dahmer was able to frequent, drug, rape, and kill Asian and black boys and young men. Racism was why the police ignored Dahmer's neighbors' calls. Racism and homophobia were why they dismissed them, begging them not to return that child to him. The media and the police refused to engage this because they didn't and don't want to put a spotlight on the deliberate and systemic failures of the police and our criminal system, which does not give a rat's ass about a bunch of missing black and brown boys and men, let alone gay ones. Despite Jeffrey Dahmer's insistence that he was a diverse and inclusive rapist and murderer, and even his own father, amid his insistence that Jeffrey wasn't a racist, still couldn't help but acknowledge the obvious when he said this: "I knew that his crimes had nothing to do with race and everything to do with madness. He had preyed upon young black men merely because they had been the easiest to prey upon. Many of them had been poor, and so they needed the paltry $50 he had offered them. Others had simply been available in the neighborhood, and he had taken advantage of the sheer convenience of having them near at hand. I saw Jeff's murders in precisely those terms, analytically rather than emotionally." Lionel Dahmer can choose all he wants to think that race had nothing to do with it when he says Jeffrey preyed upon young black men merely because they had been easiest to prey upon. But the question we have to ask is, why were they the easiest? The answer goes beyond just their poverty and the ease in which Jeffrey could get them into his home, and it extends all the way to why Jeffrey was able to keep doing this repeatedly without detection. What about young black men made them the easiest for Jeffrey to keep disappearing without the police searching for them? And that's the racism, baby. The systemic problem that allows a monster to thrive. And I think it's important to recognize how common it is, as was the case with Dahmer, that the police fail to protect victims because of their own underlying prejudices about who can be victims. There's a documentary on Peacock about a TikTok star named Ali Abulaban who went by Gein Kid, who murdered his wife and her friend that he was jealous of. Ali had nearly 1 million TikTok followers in 2021 when he brutally shot and killed his wife, Anna. a woman from the Philippines. Prior to killing Anna though, he verbally abused her openly on his social media, called her all kinds of bitches and hoes, accused her of cheating on him and just generally being a cokehead nut. He actually used to be on live doing coke, cursing his wife and mother of his 7-year-old daughter out like a dog. And beyond even what he'd do on Instagram and TikTok lives for all to see, he would also record his own interactions with her in regular life for his own keeping, where he would berate her mercilessly, especially in regard to whether she was having sex with him enough, all while positioning himself as the victim because he felt entitled to sex with her as his wife. And he also had come to the conclusion that there was no way a beautiful woman like her wasn't going without sex for a month, so if she wasn't having sex with him, she was cheating on him. Mind you, as the documentary exposes, it was actually Ali who was cheating on his wife and abusing her verbally and physically. After years of abusing Anna, weaponizing the immigration system against her by threatening to have her deported and to take her child if she tried to leave him, she finally had enough.
Taking away my whole life. I got a top secret clearance. Trying to it up.
About a month before Anna Abulaban's death.
I'll bring you to San Diego for what? So you can run to your friends?
Her husband, Ali Abulaban, known as Gin Kid online, posted this live video to TikTok.
You're not even an American citizen. I brought you to this goddamn country. Name one man that would do that for you.
In the video, Anna is calling 911 as Ali is live streaming this fight to his nearly 1 million followers.
Oh, great. You were on the phone with police while I said that? Wow. If I was petty, I would tell them that she beat me the up too. And you know what? Goodbye to your little citizenship there, Miss Filipino.
Anna's friends took the stand Thursday, testifying that Ali had physically abused Anna. They saw her bruises, and Anna would often ask her friends to help her get to safety.
When she left him, he tricked her and her daughter into moving back into their home, promising that he would move into a hotel. But instead, he copied a key, broke into the home and vandalized it, left a listening device on his daughter's iPad, and when he returned to his home to listen in on Anna, she and her friend Ray were in the living room attempting to clean up the mess he made when he vandalized the home. But upon hearing the sound of a man's voice, he took his gun, drove over there, and shot them both repeatedly. And he fucking recorded it. He was convicted of first-degree murder.
We never had a kid together because of how stupid you are. And I can't wait to divorce you so I can start my new life. You're gonna be sitting on the couch, drinking your tequila, sitting next to your gym rat boyfriend with tattoos, who doesn't have the brain to hold a conversation, and you're gonna watch Netflix one day, and you're gonna see my face on Netflix. Hey, isn't that your husband? And your daughter is my daughter. So you're gonna see my face for the rest of your life.
And as you just heard, we cut the audio during the times that Ali Abulaban had been heard cursing during these audio messages. In court, you could see Ali Abulaban very uncomfortable as these played out in court. These audio messages, though, are just a small glimpse at what was played. In most of them, you could hear him cursing at Anna, trying to control her in some aspect, demanding to know where she was and who she was with, telling her that she is not single, calling her disparaging names.
But here's the thing. Remember I told you Ali was a nutjob wackadoodle who was recording his abuse of Anna and their private life. So the documentary literally features the recordings of him speaking to the police after Anna would call them to tell them how he's beat her, how he has pulled out a gun and threatened to kill himself in front of her daughter. And not only did the police fail to intervene, you can literally hear the footage of Ali playing on the police's biases. He tells them she's an immigrant and he brought her to America and this is how she repays him, and that she wants to leave him and be with another man. Never mind the fact that she's telling the police he abused her and he's not even bothering to deny it because they sympathize with him. Oh, poor man, you brought this immigrant woman to America and she doesn't worship you? Poor you. It's only you, the man, who knows what's best for your household. Who cares what abuse this woman is alleging? Of course you need to do what you need to do.
Bring her to this country and on a visa. She's Filipino, man. I did everything. We lived in Virginia. I worked for the government. Our life was set. Same a friend here. She's got friends here that she grew up with. Her lifestyle's a mess. I believe she called because she was trying to get me to leave tonight.
So somebody has to be the bigger person. What you don't want to happen is she alleges that you hit her, we have to arrest you, and now you have a arrest.
Isn't that fucked up? It's a woman's world, man.
The police didn't help Anna, and they don't help Annas of the world every day because they're not designed to. In real life, the Supreme Court has said numerous times in numerous cases that the police have absolutely no duty to protect the public. In 2005, the Supreme Court ruled that the police had absolutely no constitutional duty to protect the public from harm. Not even a woman who literally had an order of protection that required the police to arrest her violent husband who'd had a history of violently abusing her. In that case, on June 22, 1999, Jessica Gonzalez begged the Castle Rock police to find and arrest her husband, Simon Gonzalez, who she had an order of protection against and who had violated that order of protection and kidnapped their 3 children and taken them to an amusement park in Denver. The Castle Rock police ignored Jessica and refused to act until the man literally showed up to the police station hours later with her children dead in the trunk. And the Supreme Court said the police had done nothing wrong by refusing to act on the order of protection that required them to arrest him, because the police have no constitutional duty to protect anyone. The fact that the police and the criminal system at large have no duty to protect anyone brings me back to Dahmer. Lionel Dahmer, like many American parents and families, learned the hard way that the American criminal system is not actually interested in doing anything to actually try to stop the crime or address the problem. Lionel Dahmer was always in the business of trying to save Jeffrey from the consequences of his actions and the situations alcoholism would often find him in. When Jeffrey couldn't get into college on his own, he pulled some strings to get him into Ohio State. He got his mom to take him in. He helped him get jobs. But his thought process and approach finally changed when Jeffrey was arrested and convicted for child molestation. Lionel Dahmer said in his memoir, watching him as he faced the judge that day, it was hard to believe that this same son would never be more than he seemed to be. A liar, an alcoholic, a thief, an exhibitionist, a molester of children. I could not imagine how he had become such a ruined soul. In the eyes of parents, I think, children always seem just a blink away from redemption. But as I watched Jeff speak to the judge, I felt a sudden sense of my own helplessness. Suddenly, and for the first time, I no longer believed that my efforts and resources alone would be enough to save my son. From then on, I began to look for that external solution. I no longer believed that my own prodding could help my son. My son had passed beyond the reach of ordinary care. While Jeff remained at the House of Correction, I tried to secure the kind of help I thought he needed. I wrote numerous letters to Gerald Boyle, Jeff's attorney. Each letter was more emphatic than the last, and as the months passed and Jeff's release grew nearer, I became more and more determined to find some sort of independent help for my son. But in some things, I was blind as well. I continued to see Jeff's problems as primarily connected to his alcoholism. I allowed myself to believe that if addiction could be addressed, then his other behaviors would correct themselves. I did not want to confront the fact that Jeff was lost to more than alcoholism. I wrote letter after letter to Jeff's lawyer, all of them pleading that Jeff be placed in some kind of highly structured treatment program. I was convinced that if Jeff left prison without being rid of his alcoholism, that he would continue to commit acts of sexual assault and molestation. I told Jeff's attorney that I did not think he should be allowed an early release from prison, in view of the fact that he had received no alcohol treatment while in prison. Mr. Boyle replied that the matter of treatment should be taken up with Jeff's probation officer, and that as Jeff's lawyer, it was his duty to seek early release if that is what Jeff wanted, which it was. 2 things are happening there. Jeff's father recognizes that simply throwing his son in a cage won't actually address the problem with his son. It won't prevent him from ending up back there. He doesn't truly know what his son's problem is or what additional resources could truly help him, but he knows he needs something more than locking him up and sending him back into the world as he was, or worse. But the second thing happening is that Jeff's father is trying to get the legal system to intervene. But as Jeff's father came to learn, it's his son's lawyer's legal obligation to follow his son's requests, not his. But more importantly than that, is the fact that Jeff's lawyer has no say in this. He has no ability to place Jeff in a program of any kind that he doesn't want, or to unilaterally get court-mandated help for Jeff. And it's important to take note of this fact, because the police and media are always tricking people into believing their ire should be with defense attorneys, who have virtually no say in what the legislators, prosecutors, and judges with the power decide, or the fact that they've created a system that is deliberately meant to be punitive, not to rehabilitate. But like it was for Jeff's father, Lionel, the defense attorney is usually the first or most immediate point of contact. So that's usually who gets the most requests and frustrations with the situation at large placed on their shoulders, which is something I can say from personal experience as a former public defender. But Lionel did eventually direct his request at the right party, at which point he learned a lesson that you're about to. Lionel said, "After that, I had no recourse but to go directly to the court. On March 1st, 1990, I wrote Judge Gardner a letter concerning my fears for Jeff and those he might injure if he were released before his alcoholism had been effectively treated. I went over the fact that Jeff had avoided therapeutic intervention in the past, and that even when he had been treated, it had been under the direction of a therapist who was not specialized in treating alcoholics, and that no reports about progress or lack of progress had been made either to the court or to the Office of Probation and Parole. I have tremendous reservations about Jeff's chances when he hits the street," I told Judge Gardner. "I sincerely hope that you might intervene in some way to help my son, whom I love very much and for whom I want a better life." I told the judge that I had heard of a treatment program that claimed great success in rehabilitating alcoholics, and that Jeff's placement in a similarly rigorous program was critical to his future. "I do feel that this may be our last chance to institute something lasting," I wrote in the last line of my letter, "and that you can hold the key." At the end of February 1990, I learned that Jeff was going to be released early from the Milwaukee County House of Correction, having served only 10 months of the 12-month sentence. He would be on probation for the next few years, but other than occasional visits to his probation officer, Jeff would be completely free. Knowing what we know now about Jeffrey Dahmer, I'm sure we all agree that he needed help with a lot more than with his alcoholism. But even that baseline care wasn't provided by the criminal system, because the criminal system does not actually care about preventing more crime from reoccurring. It's not designed to interrogate why crime is happening or to help those struggling with it. And that important point of analysis gets lost in dehumanized media coverage and portrayals of serial killers that prefer to gloss over the complicated and nuanced realities of who they were and how they did what they did. Which brings me to my next chapter. If you've been following along, you know that dehumanization is a bad thing. But it's also important to remember that dehumanization does not always look like tearing someone down. It also looks like mythologizing them, glorifying them.
Newell Emmons is an ex-convict who first met Manson in prison in the 50s. He claims he wrote the Manson book after 7 years of conversation with Manson to show that he's no leader, no guru, but just a loser.
Why should anyone care to read this book?
My purpose when I first started was virtually to destroy the myth. I showed that he's not as complex or as the occult leader, or etc., that he's been projected as being.
Deifying people is also dehumanizing, and Ted Bundy is a perfect example of how and why. Ted Bundy is the face of serial killers whose looks and intelligence are attributed to why they were able to get away with so many murders. That's the mythology the police and the media created around him, and it's one that deliberately gives him too much credit. Ted Bundy was an okay student who couldn't get into any of his top choices for law school, and he was not attracting, luring, or murdering women based on his dashing good looks. What was actually happening, he would often pretend to be disabled, often adorning crutches, neck braces, and the like, and he would ask unsuspecting women for help, and then he would attack and murder them. He did not evade police capture because he was so intelligent or some master of crime. In fact, his live-in fiance had reported him to the police several times when she realized that he and her car he'd been driving matched the description released by the police. And multiple police departments dismissed her, refusing to follow up on Ted or even to consider him as a suspect. She said in her memoir, "Since the summer of 1974, I had been tormented by fears that Ted was involved in the murders in the Seattle area. Finally, I had gone to the King County Police with my suspicions. They told me they had checked Ted out and eliminated him as a suspect. But I continued to worry, and in January 1975, I talked to the police in Salt Lake City. They also told me he was clear." Mythologizing Ted Bundy as exceptionally intelligent, attractive, and cunning is a way to obfuscate from the kinds of routine police failures that can have catastrophic consequences. Ted Bundy killed at least 12 women between the time his fiance first reported him to the police and when he was eventually arrested during a traffic stop. Mind you, lookism was still very relevant in the case of Ted Bundy, but it wasn't necessarily relevant to how he was able to commit or get away with his crimes. That had more to do with the nature of policing and how white men and whiteness are treated by police in the criminal system. Something that was aptly depicted in the movie about Ted Bundy, Extremely Wicked, Shockingly Evil, and Vile, starring Zac Efron, was how Ted Bundy represented himself pro se and was allowed to own the courtroom and even be complimented by the judge in the end. And I am telling you, as a former public defender who represented hundreds and hundreds of people in criminal court every day for years, that display from Bundy had nothing to do with exceptional ability, good looks, charisma, or intelligence, and everything to do with him being a white man, period. Each and every single time my black or brown clients have ever so much as opened their fucking mouth to the judge, let alone represented themselves pro se, they would be chastised by the court to speak through me, their attorney. Advocating for themselves was never received warmly by the court. But on the rare occasion I'd represent a white guy, they would often go into monologues on their own behalf that the judges would embrace in their favor. It wasn't intelligence or good looks doing the heavy lifting for Ted Bundy. It was being a white man. Which is why we can't think of a single black person who's ever been accused of crimes like Bundy and them and been mythologized by the police, media, courts, or public as getting away with their crimes because they were so intelligent or good looking. Even O.J. Simpson didn't get that treatment. The closest I've ever gotten to that was Prison Bay Jeremy Meeks, and all he did was steal. Because it's not actually about those things. It's about whiteness and the way white men are privileged in society as a whole, but especially in the courts. It's just being packaged other ways. What lookism was relevant to as it pertained to Ted Bundy was public reception and perception. People, namely young white women, supported him, cared about him, more than they did the victims, because their attraction to him made it either too difficult for them to believe he was guilty or too difficult for them to care.
Every time he turns around, I kind of get that feeling, oh no, you know, he's gonna get me next. You know?
But yet you're fascinated by him.
Very, very. Every night when I go to bed, I just, you know, I get very scared and I shut my door and lock it, you know.
I'm not afraid of him. He just doesn't look like the type to kill somebody. You try to imagine yourself in his place and to see how he's feeling, looking at the pillows with blood stains and everything, if he really did it or not.
The trial has drawn women from as far away as Seattle, where Bundy is suspected of other sex murders. Why is this happening? According to one psychiatrist, it is a mixture of fear, intrigue, and in particular, sexual attraction.
And so, yes, I do think this is, in an underlying sense, a sexual attraction, using that word very broadly for the moment. But there's no question but what violence does quicken the pulse of many people, and certainly of young women.
The young women themselves aren't too sure what it is that attracts them to the trial.
Are you a little scared when you look at him?
Yes, it scares me to be in the same room with him, but I know there's other people in there, so.
Why do you do it?
I don't know.
Lookism was important to Ted Bundy's public perception, not his crimes. And that says more about us as a society than it does about him. Which brings me to the issues that people have with casting very attractive people to play infamous serial killers in fear of humanizing them. It's true that people are more likely to humanize attractive people than unattractive people. If you haven't watched my video, If Pretty is a Privilege, Ugly is a Curse, do that when you're done here. I promise it's worthwhile and relevant. It's true that if you depict a fictional or real serial killer as attractive in pop culture, there will be people who can't get past their attraction to them. That's been proven time and time again. From Christian Bale's Patrick Bateman in American Psycho, to Michael C. Hall's Dexter, to Penn Badgley's Joe Goldberg. It's undisputably true that people are more likely to humanize attractive people than unattractive people because we live in a lookist society. And thus, it's true that people are more likely to humanize a serial killer played by an attractive person than an unattractive person. But one, we should humanize them. And two, the real problem is not that we humanize attractive people, it's that we dehumanize unattractive people. And that's something that we should be addressing and unlearning as a society, not leaning into and demanding that all evil be depicted and represented as ugly. We must divorce ourselves from this idea that beauty and desirability either does or should have something to do with morality. We should be critiquing a lookist culture that associates morality with looks and can't seem to care about murder if the murderer looks good, not reinforcing it. Penn Badgley, who plays the fictional serial killer Joe Goldberg in Netflix's You, has relentlessly criticized people lusting over and romanticizing Joe. And he's even talked about how he deliberately tried to perform certain scenes to emphasize what a sicko Joe really was to the audience, but he was stopped. For example, he shared that there's a scene in season 1 where Joe is masturbating outside of Beck's window when he's stalking her, and that his first take of that scene was extra weird, like it is. But the show folks said, nah, buddy, this is a TV show. We need folk to still like this guy. Don't do it like that.
And one of the things that I struggled with a lot when I first took the role was like,
I don't want to lean away from the horrific aspects of this person. I don't want to be just, as we've said, it's hard not to glorify actually almost anything you see on camera. So I'm going to just be conscious of that. But what I did is that I was slow and my eyes were open. And I just, I was like, I am going to be very slow. And I am not going to fucking blink. and at some point, and his name is Lee Tolan Krieger, shout out to Lee. He comes up and he was trying to be very kind, and he was like, hey, so I think we're gonna have to get you to close your eyes. Because I was already very conscious of not wanting to be like sexily masturbating outside of the street of. By the way, if I name it, it's weird, but it's the show. Kills her at the end. Spoiler alert.
In other words, while Penn Badgley is objectively very attractive, there is a way he can perform Joe to make him even more irredeemable to us as the audience, in spite of his attractiveness. So the issue isn't inherently in him being attractive and cast to play Joe, but how he plays him. More specifically, how he's allowed to play him. I say all that to say, I think it's problematic to intentionally depict bad people as ugly, just like I think there's utility in depicting good-looking people as bad, because it helps divorce us from this idea that good-looking means good person. So my problem isn't casting, it's the performance. But that being said, that doesn't mean that there isn't something to be said or critiqued about hiring hyper-attractive actors to play these roles if the roles didn't actually call for it. Because then it begs the question, why? Why have you chosen Charlie Hunnam's fine ass to play Ed Gein? What are you hoping to accomplish? Is it just in hopes of increasing the odds people are able to humanize them? Which I'd argue isn't inherently a bad thing. Or are you hoping to do something more? Like romanticize them, sexualize them, glorify them. There's something to be said about bending over backwards to hypersexualize these roles where it isn't necessary. In the instances of people like Ted Bundy, where most people, not me, but most people, agree that the killer was attractive and that being attractive was a factor in their case and infamy, perhaps it makes sense to hire a conventionally attractive person to play him. Zac Efron is still probably a stretch, but not offensively so. But perhaps it's time these media depictions of Ted Bundy stop leaning into mythologizing his looks and overrepresenting what role they played in his crimes, which was very little, and actually humanize him long enough to explore the regular ass, sick ass white man that he was, so we could actually try to understand how the fuck he got like that.
I've met a lot of men who were motivated to commit violence just like me.
But the point is, if their looks were relevant to their case, perception or reality, it makes sense that be depicted. Which is why, when Luigi Mangione gets a movie about him, they will be hiring somebody fine like Dave Franco to play him. Not to lump Luigi with the likes of the sick we're discussing in this video, but you get my point. Whilst I'd concede that Zac Efron was a stretch to play Ted Bundy, although not offensively so, I think Evan Peters was perfect casting for Jeffrey Dahmer. It doesn't sound like a compliment to say Evan Peters was born to play that role, but put him and Dahmer's picture side to side. They ate that shit up. Dahmer was sick, not ugly. Even in the case of someone like Ed Gein, where he's just an average looking man, I don't necessarily take issue with Charlie Hunnam fine ass playing him. They not only transformed Charlie to look more like Ed than himself, they didn't do anything additional to try to make us attracted to him, in my personal opinion. Which is more than I can say for Monster's installment of the Menendez brothers, where they went out of their way to overtly and unnecessarily hypersexualize the brothers in a way that left me confused as to what I was watching and what the takeaway was even supposed to be.
It's just us now. We're on our own.
Like, what the actual fuck was that, dog? Sexualizing and romanticizing these people is wrong, and it's also dehumanizing, which brings me to something I want to make clear. Your problem is not with humanizing serial killers. It's with excusing them, deifying them, glorifying them, sexualizing them, romanticizing them, all of which is actually dehumanization. So let's finally talk about what led me down the rabbit hole to making this video. Monster, the Ed Gein story. The first thing I'm required to make sure that y'all know is that my little sister Femi has an encyclopedic knowledge of serial killers, and as such, smoke would come out of her fucking ears if she watched this video and did not see me make sure that y'all know that despite how Ed Gein was depicted in this show as well as throughout popular culture, he was not a serial killer. By definition, a serial killer is someone who commits a series of murders, usually 3 or more. He also wasn't a cannibal, nor was he a necrophiliac contrary to popular belief, meaning he was neither eating nor fucking the bodies. The story of Ed Gein is quite frankly not half as sensational or evil as it's dramatized to be in pop culture, or as we're led to believe based on the kind of fictional he's inspired like Norman Bates, Hannibal Lecter, or Leatherface. But don't get me wrong, Ed Gein was a sicko into some sick shit. He may not have been fucking or eating the bodies, but the was wearing them. Ed Gein was a schizophrenic man who was obsessed with his mother, and upon her death, he became a grave robber. He would dig up the graves of middle-aged women who reminded him of his dead mother, take their bodies and turn their skin and body parts into parts of his woman suit and other household items. In addition to robbing graves, he eventually murdered 2 elderly women, Mary Hogan and Bernice Worden. A cold winter had made it too difficult for him to dig up graves, so he went into town and killed 2 elderly women that reminded him of his mother so that he could go skin up their bodies and be a weird ass. So Ed Gein wasn't a serial killer, nor did he kill several of the other people he's depicted as murdering in Ryan Murphy's Monster. Naturally, when a town finds out the local weird killed old ladies and was digging up bodies and doing weird shit with the body parts, they wondered whether that weird had have been responsible for other weird shit that happened, like the death of Ed's own brother Henry, a 14-year-old girl named Evelyn Hartley, and 2 men named Victor Harold Travis and Raymond Burgess. But there is absolutely no evidence of any kind to tie him to what happened to any of those people. Furthermore, when Ed Gein was arrested in 1957, he confessed to the murder of Mary Hogan and Bernice Worden, consented to lie detector tests, which would be unreliable if used against him at trial, but they weren't, as Ed Gein wasn't found mentally competent to stand trial. But in any event, the lie detector test showed him to be truthful because the police were able to corroborate what he told them during the test, because he informed them that he would dig up graves and sometimes return the bones when he was done with the bodies. And he told them which grave they could dig up where they'd find a body gone, and this was true. Moreover, and most importantly as it pertains to the issue of what crimes he actually commit, when Ed Gein was arrested, the police discovered at his home the bodies of the 2 women he admitted to killing, as well as the body parts of many other corpses he dug up from the cemetery. Specifically, they found the following sick-ass items in his home. Whole human bones and fragments, a wastebasket made of human skin covering several chairs, human skulls mounted on bedposts, female skulls, some with the top sewn off, bowls made from human skulls, a corset made from a female torso skin from shoulder to waist, leggings made from human leg skin, masks made from the skin of female heads, Mary Hogan's face mask in a paper bag, Mary Hogan's skull in a box, Bernice Worden's entire head in a burlap sack, Bernice Worden's heart in a plastic bag in front of Gein's potbelly stove, 9 vulvas in a shoebox, a young girl's dress, and the vulvas of 2 females judged to have been about 15 years old, a belt made from female human nipples, 4 noses, a pair of lips on a window shade drawstring, a lampshade made from the skin of a human face, and fingernails from female fingers. I say all that to say, Ed Gein was significantly less sick than his pop culture depiction and fictional offspring, but he was still a very sick. Nonetheless, let's be clear, but we know exactly what he did and did not do. Now that that's understood, to enumerate some of the most popular criticisms of the Ed Gein story, as well as other installments of Ryan Murphy's Monster series. 1, that they wrongfully humanized them. 2, that they're factually inaccurate. And 3, that they sexualized the killers, leading people to sympathize with and even lust after them instead of caring about their victims. And as I stated earlier, for some people, the third critique, that they sexualize him, isn't just in that the show is written, directed, or produced in a way that actively and overtly sexualizes the killer, but that it's inherently problematic to cast attractive people to portray these people in the first place, because people would naturally humanize them based on their good looks, even if the show didn't do anything additional to sexualize or humanize them. But we've already addressed that. Let's go through some of the other criticisms as they apply to the Ed Gein installment, starting with the first one, that they wrongfully humanized him. Or rather, what people really mean when they say that, which is that they tried to make you sympathize with him. It's not as sensational as the Butcher of Plainfield, but the truth is, Ed Gein was a sick man, but he was not a monster. And by not a monster, what I mean is that he wasn't some inexplicable boogeyman acting acting on an evil from within. He was a troubled boy who needed help that grew into a seriously disturbed man who never got it. He was born in a small town in Wisconsin that he never once left. He was poor, deeply schizophrenic, and isolated from the world on a farm with his fucked up religious zealot, abusive parents who had neither the resources, wherewithal, or right mind to get him any help, because they were probably fucked up themselves. And in a different world where he was born to a household, community, or society that respected mental health, he would have probably been just fine. Which is part of the reason that I don't think Monster overly humanized Ed Gein or wrongfully tried to garner him sympathy, and that in actuality, they dehumanized him, because that's what propaganda aims to do. And my evidence for this is in what they chose to add to the story, twist in the story, and omit from the story. These are some of the biggest misrepresentations or outright fiction presented in Monster that stood out to me. They claimed he killed his brother Henry, but there is no evidence supporting that, just speculation. In the show, he's shown as kidnapping and murdering a 14-year-old girl named Evelyn Hartley because she took his babysitting job. That never happened. In reality, the girl was babysitting for a college professor when she was kidnapped from his home. They never found her body or any evidence as to what happened to her, and there's absolutely no evidence tying Ed Gein to her. Moreover, in 2004, a man named Mel Williams came forward with a conversation he recorded at a bar in 1969. Although his goal had been to record a performing musical group, the conversation between two men was unintentionally recorded as well. On the tape, one of the men, Clyde Tywee Peterson, implicated himself, Jack Golfair, and an unnamed third party in the disappearance of Evelyn Hartley, also claiming that Evelyn was murdered and buried in Lafarge, Wisconsin after her kidnapping. The unnamed party is now deceased. Golfair committed suicide on December 25, 1967, and Peterson died of a heart attack in 1974. They depicted Ed Gein murdering two missing hunters, but there is no evidence to support that. They depicted Ed Gein as having a romantic relationship with his 58-year-old victim Bernice Worden, as well as they depicted her as a town whore, while absolutely none of that is true. They presented his rumored ex-girlfriend Adeline Watkins as a depraved and evil accomplice who presented him with the materials and opportunity that led him into a life of sick shit. None of that is true. They depicted Ed Gein's victim Bernice Worden's son Frank Worden as the deputy sheriff who discovered his mother's body gutted like a deer on Gein's farm and then promptly beat him up. They depicted Ed Gein as helping the police catch other serial killers. They also depicted Ed Gein as a cannibal, a necrophiliac, and a gynophiliac. This is not an exhaustive list of the misrepresentations in Monster's Ed Gein story, but I've highlighted them because they illustrate some of my fundamental issues with true crime and the idea that we should demonize criminals in these stories in order to honor the victims. Like I said earlier, Ed Gein was not a serial killer. He was a schizophrenic grave robber who would make household items out of corpses, and he murdered two women, Mary Hogan and Bernice Worden. Yet, the show places 4 additional murders on him that he was investigated and cleared of, and they chose to depict him as a cannibal, a necrophiliac, and gynophiliac because otherwise they did not have quite enough to put him alongside the likes of Jeffrey Dahmer or to carry an 8-episode limited series devoted to a monster. So they made up more horrific crimes than he committed to make the monster label fit, which isn't the extent of the propaganda, mind you. They also depicted him as helping the police catch Ted Bundy. I'll take shit that never happened for $500, Alex. I don't know if Mindhunter is responsible for this kind of propaganda, but they certainly love it down. Because what they're doing is teaching you that the only way these irredeemable monsters that they've convinced you are just inherently evil somehow find goodness to redeem themselves is by enthusiastically helping catch other monsters like them from behind bars. The show depicted Ed Gein's victim Bernice Worden's son Frank Worden as the deputy sheriff, and there's an insidious reason for doing that. Frank Worden was not the deputy sheriff. He was the chief of the fire department. But the show depicts him as the deputy sheriff who finds his mother gutted and strung up like a hog in Gein's farm and then promptly beats the fuck out of him, in addition to auctioning off his belongings and against the wishes of the sheriff. But none of this happened. What actually happened was that during Ed Gein's interrogation, Sheriff Art Schley assaulted Gein by banging his head and face into a brick fucking wall, which rightfully resulted in Gein's confession being ruled inadmissible. Additionally, not only did Frank Worden actually oppose the auction of Gein's homes and belongings, when Gein's home mysteriously caught fire, Worden, the chief of the fire department, let it burn down. But rather than present those facts to us, that a police officer unlawfully brutalized Ed Gein and violated his rights, which hurt the case against him, the show portrayed it as having been done by the victim's own son, so audiences would excuse the police brutality as understandable. The second major criticism people had of the show, that it just wasn't accurate, is true. They took many creative liberties with Ed Gein's story, some of which we've already discussed. I won't lie to y'all and say that I never find myself wondering why, if they're gonna make shit up, they don't just tell a completely fictional story to begin with. But then I remember that just like I have to create thumbnails, hooks, and titles for my videos that'll get you to watch it, the makers of these shows are also choosing notorious serial killers, hoping that the name recognition gets you to watch. And I feel like I would be a hypocrite if I completely dismissed that as a totally illegitimate reason to do it. Even though something don't feel right to me about presenting something as the story of a motherfucker's life and making shit up, because the average person is going to accept what you're showing them at face value. And killer or not, truth matters. Nevertheless, I don't inherently take issue with people taking liberties with the facts of the story, but I do look at what they choose to add, omit, or twist, and I consider why those changes were made, and many of the liberties taken with this story are precisely why I disagree with people who think the creators of the show went out of their way to overly or unfairly humanize Ed Gein. Beyond the fact that I would argue that you inherently dehumanize someone when their life is reduced to an installment in something called Monsters, but they also went out of their way to depict him as responsible for numerous murders he didn't commit. They put a bunch of shit on his rap sheet he wasn't guilty of or was never diagnosed with, and the redemption they try to give him in the end, which is what I think most people take issue with, even though they take issue for different reasons than I do, is that he's portrayed as living happily enough in a mental institution, helping the police catch other serial killers. Which not only never happened, it's proof of how these stories that we somehow think are humanizing these killers actually dehumanize them in order to turn them into tools of propaganda. They're literally creating fictitious events where the only way for people they've told you were especially sick, evil, and irredeemable people that need to be locked away can find a semblance of redemption by aligning themselves with the state to lock other people away. That's why shows like Mindhunter are so loved. We especially like lumping these killers together as one big homogenous vat of evil monsters who could somehow speak to each other's shared evil, when in reality, they were people who didn't know one another and were the products of their own individual life stories, traumas, and issues, not just from some evil within. So you would have to interrogate their backgrounds as people to understand what went wrong, as opposed to just applying a one-size-fits-all bandage to them as monsters.
What do I think of Jeffrey Dahmer? I don't know the man personally, but I'll tell you this, that's a good example as to why insanity doesn't belong in the courtroom. Because if Jeffrey Dahmer doesn't meet the requirements for insanity, then I'd hate like hell to run into the guy that does.
Do you feel
beyond that? I have no comment on Jeffrey Dahmer because I'm not Jeffrey Dahmer, and I would not. Whether it's Berkowitz, whether it's Bundy, whether it's Williams, Wayne Williams down in Atlanta, or any of the others, or Charlie Manson. See, I don't comment about other cases for the simple fact is that I wasn't there.
You feel somewhat of a kinship with some of these people?
God, I hate that when they put me in the same club with them.
That's precisely the club that John Gacy belongs in.
For years now, people have honed in on critiquing true crime and shows like these that I guess fall into some kind of quasi-related genre for not being considerate enough to the victims and their loved ones. And that isn't without merit, although it's not the subject of this particular video. What I'm critiquing more specifically in this video is how this idea that we should respect and honor victims seems to have become inextricably tied to this idea that we should demonize the people who harmed them, omit anything that might humanize them, and or turn them into props for advancing a particular view of the world, good and evil, and criminality.
Whether or not we have sort of sympathy after the fact, and certainly these acts are horrific and despicable, the question is, what is the effective way of dealing with it? What we do now is we wait till someone kills a bunch of people, then finally we find them, sometimes when they're not even actively killing people anymore, and we make a theater of getting rid of them. But where were the interventions in middle school? Where were the interventions in high school? Where were the early warning systems that could have saved so many lives if we just provided an infrastructure of care for young kids in crisis? And instead, we have often an infrastructure of further abuse.
The idea that we shouldn't tell stories in a way that humanizes criminals or adds context, explanations, or relevant information that may help understand how they became who they did or commit the crimes they did so that we could better prevent it from happening again in the future is a product of the prison industrial complex.
You know, the popularity of these shows are both a reflection of people's investment in that kind of mindset of good, evil, punishment, vengeance, and the desire for powerful actors to get people to see the world that way, because it sort of lets them off the hook for their everyday banality of evil in the way that they organize the economy, allow kids to live in poverty, defund schools and essential services and all the rest.
Because the prison industrial complex relies on the demonization of any and everyone who ends up its victim, so that we don't care about all the human rights tragedies that happen in the prisons. We don't care about who ends up in prison or why, and we don't care about how merciless and unjust policing, the courts, or the legislators are, or how much money is made on the backs of a for-profit prison system that functions by ensuring more and more people go to prison. Not that we get less crime or become safer. Quite the opposite, because we don't actually believe in redemption for many, if not most or all of these people. To quietly consent to that system, it's necessary that we hold no space for the humanity of those at its mercy. So they make this connection in your mind that humanizing people who commit crimes means you can't or won't hold them accountable, or that you don't or can't care about victims and prioritize their interests. And as a result, we come to believe that the moral or just thing to do is to ensure people who commit crime, especially people who commit horrific crime, like the likes of Jeffrey Dahmer or Ed Gein, means they must be depicted in the most negative light, the one that presents them as one-dimensional monsters, evil, or inherently and inexplicably bad, with no redeeming quality, explanations for how they came to be, or paths for redemption. And that line of thinking is the underlying basis for Son of Sam laws, and an entire industry built on making billions off the lives and crimes of people who we don't truly allow to tell their own stories. If you don't know what Son of Sam laws are, I'm happy to explain. Son of Sam laws refers to a series of laws all across the United States preventing criminals from profiting from books, movies, interviews, any and everything made about their crimes. These laws vary state by state, but they get their name, Son of Sam laws, from infamous serial killer David Berkowitz, aka the Son of Sam. When David Berkowitz was finally arrested in 1977 after going on what was called a murder spree in New York City, there was such a media circus around his case that people worried that he would sell his story. So New York legislators scrambled to create a law to prevent him from doing so, despite the fact that he had never expressed any interest in doing this. I also think it's worth pointing out the irony in the fact that these laws were allegedly passed to prevent criminals from profiting by going out and telling their stories, when what's usually the case, the government and the media often harassed them and often coerced them into telling their stories so they could sell it for their own profit. In fact, Jeffrey Dahmer's father, Lionel, wrote this in the afterword of his memoir. Jeff agonized to me about giving in when a Milwaukee psychologist appeared early one morning at CCI and pressed Jeff to sign over his rights to the many hours of interviews. The psychologist had told him, Jeff said, that the material would be used only for teaching purposes and classes. When the material showed up in a commercial book, Jeff felt betrayed and manipulated, as I did when the detailed family history, which I supplied in confidence to help Jeff in the insanity defense, showed up in the same book. Anyway, back to Berkowitz and the Son of Sam laws. The New York law was rightfully struck down in a unanimous Supreme Court decision where the court asserted that the law was an overbroad violation of the First Amendment's right to free speech. Despite this, that original New York law became the blueprint for many, many laws like it to follow after, with most jurisdictions now having their own Son of Sam law. And even in those that don't, in every state, victims and their families can sue for damages. The rationale for Son of Sam laws are that criminals shouldn't be able to profit from their crimes, whilst everyone else and their mama can and does. And I am confident that as I'm saying this, 9 out of 10 of you are probably saying to yourselves that that sounds perfectly fine to you. And I get that, but I'd also like to explain some of the issues with it.
There's space to say things about like the financial gain and restitution to victims, which any kind of like restorative process or deeper sense of like a just outcome here certainly should include, diverting any financial gains from any of this away from offender to the victims in these cases. So, I'm sympathetic to that. But doing it just as a way to censor those voices is misguided, in part because if we are trying to work with a kind of deeper sense of justice, we want to leave open always the possibility of more truth-telling. Because often what we find is the survivors, the victims, the families, they want to know what happened. Why did this happen? And what could be done to stop it from happening in the future? Now, obviously, some of the folks who've committed these horrible harms are not really telling the truth, are not really providing what's wanted. They're trying to self-aggrandize themselves as part of their kind of pathology. So I think we need, some mechanisms to talk about that, but I don't think a kind of blanket censorship is the way to go.
The very idea that once a person passes through the criminal system, they should lose the right to their own likeness and their own story is dehumanizing and a reflection of how our criminal system strips people of their humanity and personhood long after they've done their time or paid for their crimes. I know that because we're talking about this in the context of serial killers who are responsible for less than 1% of crime, it may be hard to empathize with or see the larger problem here. But zoom out and think about all the people caught up in the United States criminal system, the vast majority of whom are people of color living beneath the poverty line, charged with non-violent crimes and crimes of poverty. Now think about what it means that those people can't profit from telling their own stories, sharing their own perspectives, but everyone else can. And more than that, we expect and demand that the people profiting off of their stories, making millions retelling, dramatizing, and distorting their stories however they'd like, do so with as little acknowledgement of their humanity as possible, effectively turning the lives and stories of anyone who's ever been at the mercy of the criminal system into propaganda for the prison industrial complex. Propaganda. And we don't require the people that we allow to profit off of those stories to honor victims or their wishes, despite claiming that that's the rationale for prohibiting criminals from being humans in their own stories. And Monster's Ed Gein's story is a perfect example of why I think Son of Sam laws are insincere in their stated goals of protecting and honoring victims. Because we won't allow criminals to profit from their stories as to honor victims, but we'll allow like Ryan Murphy to falsely depict one of Gein's victims, Bernice Warden, as the elderly town whore who slept with everything walking, including Gein, none of which is true. Son of Sam laws are more about taking the rights to and control of the stories of people who pass through the criminal system to use them for propaganda than they are about protecting victims. We've been over this. Propaganda is designed to manufacture support for policing prisons and harsher sentencing. And as such, true crime and shows like Monster are routinely created, usually without input from the people whose crimes are the subject, their attorneys, or anyone not wishing to sensationalize them. Although, to be fair, they're also created with or without the blessing of the victim's loved ones, many of whom object to what they feel is the sensationalism of their loved one's killer and murder, as well as it just re-traumatizes them as a life-changing traumatic experience becomes entertainment for millions. For example, many of the loved ones of Jeffrey Dahmer's victims objected to Netflix's Monster installment on Jeffrey Dahmer. The New York Times reported, "Wynn and families of the victims questioned the need to dramatize and humanize a serial killer at all. It couldn't be more wrong, more ill-timed, and it's a media grab," Wynn said, adding that he was disappointed in Ryan Murphy. "I thought he was better than that." Instead of focusing on the victims, Wynn said, Monster focuses on Dahmer. In an essay for Insider, Rita Isbell, whose brother Errol Lindsay was murdered by Dahmer, described watching a portrayal of her victim's statement at Dahmer's trial in the Netflix series and reliving it all over again. "It brought back all the emotions I was feeling back then," she wrote. "I was never contacted about the show. I feel like Netflix should have asked if we mind or how we felt about making it. They just didn't ask me anything. They just did it." Eric Perry, who said he was a relative of the Isbells, wrote that the series was re-traumatizing over and over again, and for what? Now listen, I am truly sympathetic to the victims' loved ones. I don't think it's anyone's place to tell them how to feel or to invalidate their feelings. Of course they don't want to watch their trauma on screen or have it memorialized in pop culture. But in response to the core of one of their questions, what's the point? Why make these things? It's because there's utility in asking why, in interrogating what happened and what could have been done to prevent it.
Why did this happen, and what could be done to stop it from happening in the future?
That's why, as much as I'm sure it pains them, the focus is often on the person bringing about the harm, because they're who we're trying to understand, because they're who we're trying to prevent. In the same New York Times article featuring the objections from some of Dahmer's victims' loved ones, they also feature some remarks from Nathaniel Brennan, an adjunct professor of cinema studies at NYU, who was teaching a course on true crime at the time of the article, who said, quote, that these kinds of true crime adaptations are by nature an exploitative genre, Even with the best intentions, he said, the victims become the pawn or a game or a symbol. Contemporary true crime often falls victim to an unresolvable tension. We can't tolerate forgetting it, but the representation of it will never be perfect, he said. That balance has become more apparent in the past 25 years. I think that professor's sentiments most reflect my own. I don't believe that honoring victims requires us to omit the POV of criminals or perpetrators of harm. Recently, I watched a Netflix documentary called Unknown Number that told the story of a teenage girl, her teenage boyfriend, and their teenage friends who were being viciously harassed by an unknown person for more than 2 years. The harassment was non-stop and revolved around an unknown person telling the teenage girl to kill herself because the unknown person wanted to do all kind of nasty, explicit sexual shit to the teenage girl's teenage boyfriend. After 2 years of the local police running around in circles, the FBI took the case and quickly realized that the culprit of this harassment was the teenage girl's own mother, who was obviously a sick, nasty, wicked fucking bitch who there's absolutely no doubt in my mind was a pedophile. The only thing that surprised people more than the mother being the culprit was that the mother was in the documentary and she was given the space to present her narrative about how she'd been a victim of SA as a teen and how that somehow made her want to torture her daughter and tell her daughter to kill herself because she wants to fuck her boyfriend. And people were fucking outraged because they felt as though the mother should not have been allowed to participate at all since she was the culprit. I disagree with this. In the same way that had she gone to trial, she would have had the right to testify, and if she chose to, the prosecution could cross-examine her so that the jury could then determine if they felt her testimony was credible. I think it's perfectly fine for her to be invited to participate in the documentary. But at that point, I think it's incumbent on whoever is interviewing her to get their cross-examination on to better help the audience judge her credibility. But even without the intense cross-examination, I too felt like the mother should have gotten from the interviewers. I, like everyone else who watched, still arrived at the conclusion that everything coming out of her mouth was a bunch of hogwash. As I touched on earlier, opponents of Son of Sam laws have usually anchored their opposition to the laws in free speech. And as a result, many Son of Sam laws have been struck down on those grounds. And I think several of those cases provide examples that better make people who think Son of Sam laws seem fine at first glance understand the slippery slope and collateral consequences of laws like these. In 1987, the publishing company Simon & Schuster sued New York on the grounds that the Son of Sam laws, an unconstitutional violation of free speech that was preventing them from publishing a book they called Wise Guy. The book was about ex-mobster Henry Hill, and it became the basis for the movie Goodfellas. The US Supreme Court heard the case in 1991, and in a unanimous decision found that the law was unconstitutional, that it would have prevented the publication of works such as the autobiography of Malcolm X. Think about that. Think about all the motherfuckers the US government has labeled criminals and what kind of valuable knowledge, narrative, and art that would not have been able to be shared. While free speech is a strong enough reason to oppose Son of Sam laws all on its own, my opposition to them is steeped in humanity and the recognition that normalizing and manufacturing consent for dehumanizing people reinforces the prison industrial complex and quashes appetite for actual crime prevention. And I'll explain what I mean by that. By stripping the humanity of people convicted of crimes, demanding that they not profit from or be humanized in their own stories, they're reduced to one-dimensional monsters who are in some way inherently or irredeemably bad, crazy, or dangerous, and thus a lost cause. Monsters needing to be put down or locked away. There's a strange irony in the connectedness between why we choose to dehumanize people who commit crimes and why the Dahmers of the world dehumanize their victims. We do it to justify what we do next.
When you depersonalize another person and view them as just an object for pleasure instead of a living, breathing human being, it seems to make it easier to
Dehumanizing people who commit crime is an essential part of justifying the known horrors and injustices of the prison industrial complex. No one cares what happens to monsters because we think they deserve what they get, and we don't believe they have any path to redemption because we believe they're true evil. And that gives the state the green light to do any and everything they want to anyone accused of a crime, not just the Dahmers. Which is why, like I said at the beginning, no one cared when Jeffrey Dahmer was brutally murdered in prison. And they certainly didn't care about the role the state's negligence played in it at minimum, or their complicity at worst, because no one believed in either his redemption nor his humanity. Lionel Dahmer published an afterword for his memoir after Jeffrey was killed in prison. And in that afterword, he said this: Some may question why I grieve for someone who did what he did. Beyond the usual true responses that he was my son, and I have all the loving memories of his very young days. I particularly grieve because for almost a year before he was murdered, he had become someone who could have nothing in common with the person who had committed the previous terrible acts. His humanity was restoring itself. Sherry and I noticed a significant reaching out. During a visit graciously approved by Warden Endicott, Jeff apologized personally to Teresa for the hurt he caused her and attempted to answer her need to know that Eddie had not suffered. The Madison, Wisconsin Church of Christ minister Roy Ratcliffe, who baptized Jeff into Christ and studied with him in prison, responded to someone's statement that the redemption of Jeff stretched his concept of God's grace. Mr. Ratcliffe replied that this was really just a simple application of God's grace. He went on to say that the negative parts of Jeff's life illustrates how low one can sink when God is not a part of your life. And on the positive side, how high one can rise when God is allowed to take charge of your life. All this was Mr. Ratcliffe's way of gently saying that if Jeff's being saved stretches your concept of grace, then that concept is smaller than the ones described in scriptures. A letter written to Mary Mott of Arlington, Virginia in April 1994 characterizes Jeff's sincerity. Dear Mrs. Mott, hello. Thank you so much for sending me the World Bible Correspondence course. Also, thank you for the Bible. I want to accept the Lord's salvation, but I don't know if the prison will allow me to be baptized. Mr. Burkham, our chaplain, is not sure if he can find someone that would be able to baptize me in prison. I'm very concerned about this. I hope that this letter finds you well and in good health. God bless you. Sincerely, Jeff Dahmer. Thus began a series of written contacts between Jeff and several wonderful people besides Mary, ending in the event that Jeff referred to in his letter to Mr. Garland Elkins of Memphis, Tennessee, part of which said, "Yes, I was baptized into Christ on May 10th around 2 p.m. It was kind of a strange day to be baptized because that was the day of the solar eclipse. Around 12 noon, most of the sun was covered, but by 2 p.m., the sun was bright and shining again. I would like to share the full plan of salvation with other inmates." Nothing got through to him until his final arrest, he said. After his arrest, Jeff said it was like a veil being lifted from him, and he seemed to be able to discuss his ultimate fate and even some of the discoveries that I had made and wanted to share with him. At one visit, Jeff confessed to me that previously he didn't really feel accountable for his actions, partly because of the things taught in high school and afterward everywhere he turned. As Jeff explained to Stone Phillips in the NBC Dateline interview, when asked his thoughts when he was committing such crimes, "I felt that I didn't have to be accountable to anyone. Since man came from slime, he was accountable to no one." While it is, of course, not true that every criminal or even the law-abiding person does wrong because of the hypothesis that we all came from slime, Jeff and I concurred that the teaching of only this belief as fact has stifled free thinking and affected millions of lives. The change in him seemed sincere, which makes it very hard for me emotionally. I frequently visualize his badly battered head and body on the cart at the Veterans Memorial Hospital in Madison, Wisconsin. My pain must be like that of family members of Jeff's victims. In her characteristically reassuring manner, Sherry tells me that Jeff is at peace now. Part of me agrees, but another part of me wants Jeff to have lived to fulfill his stated desire to share his knowledge and hopes with others. Because Jeff found new direction and goals, he lost his earlier belief that he should be dead for what he did. He did not have a death wish with no gumption to kill himself, as some were quoted to say. These people were simply out of touch with Jeff for over 2 years. Brian Masters, a well-known British author and thoughtful friend to Sherry and me, has been the singular writer having a deep insight into Jeff and the surrounding events. In a recent feature article entitled, "But He Did Not Deserve to Die," Brian, like me, asked the question, why wouldn't it have been possible for Jeff to have contributed something worthwhile? Brian cited the notorious Nathan Leopold, who helped discover a cure for malaria and wrote a math textbook while in prison. Someone said that Jeff was like a comet which comes across only once in a long time. While it sounds like a good analogy, this misses one of the main points inherent in a father's story. That is, what Jeff did was the culmination of a long series of progressive involvements with pornography and other obsessions. We are all a part of a continuum, and since the consequence of lust is more lust, it is important that parents be especially watchful for developing patterns of obsession in their children and themselves. Whether the lust manifests itself as sex, power, control, dominance, money, food, or something else, it could in the extreme lead to another Jeff, or in the less extreme, to a person anywhere along the continuum of human wrongdoing. In a very human sense, many people may be reluctant to deal with that. They want to say a little bit of lust is no problem, a little bit of sin is no problem, and it's easier to dismiss Jeff that way, as a rarity having no relevance to them or their children, much like a comet that makes a rare appearance. Some of the reactions to Jeff's murder were predictable. Congressman Traficant of Ohio ranted to his colleagues something to the effect that we should let all of them just kill each other. A Chicago AM radio talk show host proclaimed the day a celebration and said, "I'm sure if there's a hell, there's a place of special honor there for Jeffrey Dahmer now." A family member of one of Jeff's victims appeared on a national TV talk show proposing that Jeff's murderer receive a medal. Reports out of Milwaukee had some people considering Jeff's murder to be poetic justice. Rather than Jeff's murder being any kind of justice, it is just another example of the failure of the criminal justice system. The only message that one gets from the murder of Jeff is watch your back in prison. There is no message of right or wrong. There is only a message of more murder, more hate, more craziness, and more sin. Rather than glorifying in Jeff's murder, I believe anyone who is really thinking should feel humiliated that this could be allowed to happen in a super maximum security prison like Wisconsin's Columbia Correctional Institution. During one of my visits, shortly after Jeff had been attacked with a razor in July 1994, the prison chaplain was waiting for me in the lobby. After he talked to me, I felt reassured that Jeff would be secure. The attack was vicious as described to me by Jeff, but minimized in the press. The chaplain, I learned after Jeff's death, had also reassured Jeff's minister, Roy Ratcliffe. Whether the chaplain was acting in an official contact capacity or not, we do not know. But Mr. Ratcliffe and I agreed that we were lulled into a secure feeling and we felt betrayed upon hearing of Jeff's murder. I also felt guilty. I thought, have probed the warden or others regarding security after that first unsuccessful attempt on Jeff's life. I found out recently that amazingly, Jeff was allowed to be without supervision for some 20 or 40 minutes with a man who had previously attacked other people at another Wisconsin prison using makeshift weapons. This man also repeatedly threatened to kill white people. One report in July 1994 tied this person together with a threat on Jeff specifically, but CCI personnel concluded that it was not substantive. After surprising Jeff from behind and bludgeoning him to death with a 20 by 2.5-inch metal bar, this person crossed the gym area in full view of the security cameras and made good on his past repeated threats by murdering Jesse Anderson as well. The murder investigation is supposedly complete and only one person has been charged. As of this writing, the prison system has given no information regarding the following. Number 1, an inmate wrote to Jeff's attorney, Steve Eisenberg, saying that there was complicity and there was a hit squad. Number 2, Jeff and Jesse were dropped off for work detail at 8 a.m. November 28, 1994, and the person charged with their murders at 8:05 a.m. Then, no one can account for anybody from 8:05 to 8:40 a.m., including the whereabouts of the guards and the recreation director. What about sounds and screams, which are sure to have occurred? Number 3, cameras are everywhere, always rolling and monitored in a central control room. What happened? Number 4, why would a person with a history of making racial threats and attacking people with makeshift weapons in prison ever be allowed in the vicinity of a metal bar, or the broom he was carrying, or be allowed anywhere near people he specifically threatened? It's easy to tell yourself this isn't a real problem. Like, sure, people didn't care about Jeffrey Dahmer being killed in prison because it's Jeffrey Dahmer, but they'd care about those who deserve their care. But you would be wrong. Ask yourselves, when you think about victims of police brutality, who do you think of? Do you ever think about the people in jails, prisons, ICE detention, juvenile detention, being beat on, raped, and killed either by law enforcement and corrections officers or by other incarcerated people the officers allowed to do it? When last was tons of media attention given to someone killed in jail awaiting their day in court or doing their time? Did you hear about 35-year-old Jamel Floyd, who was pepper sprayed to death by corrections officers at the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn, New York, shortly before he was set to be released? Did you hear about 16-year-old Cornelius Frederick, who was murdered by the staff at Lakeside Academy Youth Facility when they suffocated him in the cafeteria while he gasped that he couldn't breathe? Did you hear about when New York corrections officers beat Robert Brooks to death? This is the shit happening every day all over this country. But dismissing the humanity of the people in the criminal system allows it to continue unchecked. But more importantly, it doesn't protect us. Because as we subject people, bad people or not, to the horrors of this world and the horrors of prison, it only corrodes the mind and worsens the problems we are pretending to use prison to correct.
From your words, as Mr. Emmons quotes them in this book, it's clear that you were guilty of murder, and yet he says in all his conversations with you, he never heard you express remorse. Have you never felt it?
Remorse for what? You people have done everything in the world to me. Doesn't that give me equal right? I can do anything I want to you people at any time I want to, because that's what you've done to me. If you spit in my face and smack me in the mouth and throw me in solitary confinement for nothing, what do you think's gonna happen when I get out of here?
Charles Manson is a wicked son of a bitch who was absolutely out of his fucking mind. But there's a lesson in the madness. What do we think happens to the people we abuse? Whether it be in or out of prison, what do we think happens to people who feel dehumanized, abused, neglected, and mistreated by this world? Maybe nothing. Or maybe we get Jeffrey Dahmer's, Ed Gein's, Ted Bundy, Charles Manson's. And I think that's too great a risk to take to not interrogate how these people come to be and what we can do to prevent them.